Okay, and likewise, there are also other instances you can actually use. You have Xubuntu, which is real good if you're running like a slower machine because it actually uses the XFCE interface. It's like a really, similar to the normal interface you normally get, but it's like a lot more stripped down. And of course, from there you also have the DSL Linux, which is more bare metal, and then you have the happy medium with Puppy Linux. And that's why we're going a little bit more into the DSL Linux later on as a as a client operating system with Ubuntu server running as a server operating system. But I'll go that a little bit further on when I finally get to the VMware discussion portion. Yeah, continue on with the slideshow. And of course, due to the open source nature of Linux, some members of the community have even gone as far as creating virtual images and live CDs based for certain needs. And this actually allows developers to limit the amount of content on a CD or image file by stripping it down to only what's needed. And one prime example would be DSL Linux, which just shows you the bare metal stuff you need to make it run on a slow machine like a 46 or a Celeron, in my instance. Okay, and this in turn actually produces a faster and more efficient system. And finally, by reducing the number of files and packages for distribution, the image becomes smaller and therefore easier to distribute through the internet, since the downloads will take less bandwidth at a reduced size. And of course, to actually get full use of a Linux and Unix machine, you gotta know how to use the command line. So I'll go on that a little bit.
This operating system image, so you get
the whole operating system. Yeah, I mean that's pretty much how like Linux works because it's open source. Yeah, well, so basically, they build it. If you go online, you can get it. So the operating systems you get are the free open source ones. Because you have Linux, different versions of Unix like BSD Unix, which is free and open source. And then you have other alternative operating systems. I think like another like BEOS, and then there's another one that's still working on called ReactOS. Right, the closest you're going to come to Windows is ReactOS, is basically like a merger of Linux and the Wine library. And Wine ironically means that Wine is not an emulator. And that basically takes the APIs of Windows into a Linux distribution, so you can actually run Windows applications within Linux. Yeah. And that's kind of like where ReactOS is going, although they're not using the Linux kernel, they're using their own type of kernel. So I think they maybe even use a little bit of the free DOS code along with it. Okay, we have free DOS, like a free implementation of DOS, which is also open source, as well as free Windows API that we have that we can actually use. And that's basically how they're building ReactOS. And so far, they've gotten to the point where it now looks like they're kind of in between Windows 98 and XP quality at this point. So basically, it's still, like I say, it's still like, it's still like alpha stage. So I'm not being too hard on it, but pretty much it will be like running Windows 98 again. But unfortunately, with even more crashes. But it'll be a step above Millennium Edition. Okay, and of course, as I mentioned earlier, you have Secure Shell, which is better than Telnet because it does use 128-bit encryption. And you definitely want to make sure you're using that if you're going to be talking within a network environment.
Yeah, I tried. I'm not sure how to use it. I downloaded it from the DoD website, but man.
Yeah, because it's not going to do anything unless you know what server that's to connect to.
Yeah.
Once you connect to a server, then you're pretty much good to go.
You gotta know the name.
Right. Yep, either the host name, the IP address, and then from there you need to have a username. So then you type it. Basically, it will be the name of the server at. Your username at then the name of the server. Then you type in it's gonna prompt for your password. Type your password in, then you're logged in.
So this is like the POP, post office protocol. It's the same type of way that my Outlook downloads from UNIX student email account.
All you gotta do is. All you gotta do is just go in there, just, open the client up, and just sometimes it lets you just click through some choices if you already used it already, or what you do is like you fill in one portion that'll say it's gonna ask for a username.
Yeah, you get in the thing.
Actually, I can show you right now. It'd be easier.
Well, I think you're trying to access a server or a mail system.
Well, I'm just trying to do something.
Because really, because Secure Shell is used to access another server, so you have to have access to another server.
Why would I ever do that?
Well, that'd be more for when you're when you're working in the field, or if you have your own computer lab. you may have a bunch of servers set up for testing,
Okay.
and then you use secure shell to access that server, so you don't physically touch that server.
Right, and then on Windows, there's a program known as WinSCP you can actually use for that. So here that's for your host name. So you type in the host name is available or the IP address. Then of course by default it goes to port 22. Type in your username, password, and then of course you hit log in to log into it.
Cause like when at work,
It seems so easy.
well it is, it's just that you have to have a system to talk to.
Right.
If you don't have a system to talk to, you don't have a credential to log on.
You got, yeah, you need a username and password.
Right,
You can't just
right.
make one.
Right.
No, well you could in your hacking.
Or-
You ever set up your own server.
Your wrong field.
Then of course you gotta go through your routing device and tell, okay, open up port 22 on this machine, and then make sure you have the connection in there good.
That is, yeah, port 22, I don't think the default's there. And, wow. I see it, just never use it.
Okay, you also, of course, from there you also have your user levels. So you have your root user, which is pretty much a default system account that grants a user full access to everything within the operating system, as well as read-write access to everything. And for security and stability issues, it's actually advised not to use this account unless it's really, really necessary, and it should also never be open to standard users, especially your guests. And then on their administrator accounts, these are pretty much user accounts assigned to administrators that carry out specific tasks, and they are given read-write access to most of the operating system files, and they can also create, modify, and delete user accounts. And of course, from there you have your domain users, pretty much your general users, your power users, are kind of like your domain users, but actually have a little bit more rights. And for especially their DBAs or software programmers, of course, they can have more access to the operating system files, but only stuff that they need to see, because you're pretty much still going by the need-to-know access base with this. And of course, your guest user accounts have even less privileges than your domain or regular users, because you're a guest. Pretty much you can read the stuff on there, but you can't write to anything. So it's kind of like you're almost looking like a web page, because everyone goes to your web page is a guest. They can see stuff on your website, but they can't write anything into your website unless you give them the permission to write to a message board. And even then, they need to have an account set up to do that.
Yeah, you can download it from USB.
Yeah.
Secure shell.
And it's also okay, and it's also very important to make sure that you disable your root SSH logins. And it's basically for security reasons to give you an extra layer of security, because hey, the hacker now has to actually figure out a username and the user's password, and then the root password along with it, instead of trying to figure out the root password by itself. And of course, valid users who still need root access can still log in and use the SU command or super user command, and then enter the root password to gain access. And of course, you're in another OS, different Linux distributions like Debian and Ubuntu, unfortunately, are notorious for this, because they pretty much leave everything at semi-root level, but some stuff still has to be done only at root. You would then use the sudo command, where you type in sudo space and then whatever command you're trying to do right afterwards.
If you're a router, like you got a router, all right, you got a regular wireless LAN set up. When you do a secure shell in there, like they have two computers, okay?
Right.
Accessing this router, can I like use secure shell and open another computer?
Yeah, it's got to make sure that the machine that you're trying to go to is set up to accept messages from for a secure shell. And then of course the client has to be able to have the software to go to a secure shell. So one machine has to be set up as a secure shell server, the other one needs to be set up as a client.
It's like VPN, then it's sort of like that type scenario. You need a both.
Right, just like with VNC, if you're on Windows, it kind of works like remote desktop, where VNC lets you do the remote control from one machine to another.
Yeah.
So VNC, someone has VNC server installed on their main desktop. You then log into a client machine to gain access to that desktop.
You use that soft.
Right. And of course, if you're going through the command prompt, you'll type in SSH space your username and then add the domain you're trying to get to. And of course, at this point, you've asked your password to proceed. We already mentioned the super user. And actually, pause again.